Lisa Carter had always known the HOA was a pain. Rules about lawn height, mailbox color, and even the acceptable shade of porch lights had been the bane of her existence since she moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago. But she'd learned to tolerate the nonsense, rolling her eyes whenever another passive-aggressive letter appeared in her mailbox about noncompliance. She had even tolerated Karen, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, who took it upon herself to inspect everyone's property on her daily walks. Lisa had overheard the woman ranting to her fellow board members about Lisa's garden gnome collection more than once. Apparently, they were an unacceptable deviation from the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Lisa had simply ignored the complaints. After all, it was her home, and she had the right to make it her own. But this was something else entirely. Lisa stood frozen in her doorway, the sight before her so absurd, so impossible, that her brain struggled to make sense of it. Her front door was wide open. A sickening sense of unease curled in her stomach as she took in the chaos inside. The hallway rug was askew, the coffee table overturned, and a decorative vase, a cherished gift from her late grandmother, lay shattered across the hardwood floor. And in the center of it all, standing on a chair and yanking at the custom-built shelf Lisa had installed just a month ago, was Karen. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. The audacity, the sheer gall of this woman. It was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. Karen wasn't just harassing her. She wasn't just writing up another petty citation. She had broken into Lisa's home. "What the hell are you doing?" Lisa's voice finally found its way out, sharp and disbelieving. Karen turned, her expression completely unfazed, as if Lisa had just caught her watering a neighbor's flowers instead of actively committing a crime. "Oh, Lisa, you're home earlier than expected." She climbed down from the chair, dusting off her hands as though she'd just finished some noble act of community service. "I was just handling a violation. This shelving unit is entirely inappropriate for the front-facing windows. It disrupts the visual harmony of the street." Lisa's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Are you serious right now?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming rage bubbling up inside her. Karen sighed, adopting the patronizing tone that made Lisa's teeth clench. "I sent multiple notices. You chose to ignore them. The HOA guidelines clearly state that all visible decorations must adhere to neighborhood standards." She gestured vaguely at the mess around her, as if this destruction was merely the unfortunate result of Lisa's own negligence. Lisa could barely process it. The level of entitlement, the absolute disregard for basic human decency, it was staggering. "You broke into my house," she said, her voice slow, incredulous. Karen scoffed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. The door was unlocked." Lisa's vision went red. "No, it wasn't." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Regardless, the point is that this—" She gestured to the shelf, as if its existence was the true crime here, had to be addressed. "The HOA has given you ample time to comply, and since you refused, I took the initiative to resolve the matter myself." Lisa had never been a violent person, but in that moment, she had to physically restrain herself from lunging at the woman. Instead, she took a breath, then another. Then she pulled out her phone. Karen frowned. "What are you doing?" Lisa didn't answer. She hit the emergency dial. 911. "What's your emergency?" Lisa's eyes stayed locked on Karen, who, for the first time, seemed to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, she had miscalculated. "I need the police at my address immediately," Lisa said, her voice eerily calm. "There's been a break-in." Karen's mouth opened and closed. "Now, let's not be hasty," she started, her tone still holding that grating superiority, though there was a slight waver now. "This is just a simple misunderstanding. There's no need to involve the authorities." But Lisa wasn't listening, because she knew, she knew, that after today, Karen would never have power over this neighborhood again. Karen had always been insufferable, but watching her stand there, trying to pretend she hadn't just broken the law, was almost comical. Almost. Lisa could feel her pulse in her ears, her hands gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Ma'am, can you confirm if the suspect is still on the premises?" the dispatcher asked. Lisa's gaze never left Karen. "Yeah, she's standing in my living room, in the middle of the mess she made." Karen's face twitched, but she still had the nerve to cross her arms. "I don't appreciate the way you're making this sound. I was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood." Lisa's laugh was sharp, bitter. "You broke into my house, Karen." Karen scoffed. "Oh, honestly, Lisa, you're making it sound like I'm some sort of criminal. I was correcting a violation." Lisa clenched her jaw. "You destroyed my things." Karen's lips pressed together, a flicker of irritation passing over her face. "That shelf was against HOA policy. I was simply—" "The officers are on their way," the dispatcher interrupted through the phone. "Please stay where you are." Lisa didn't even have to ask. She wasn't about to let Karen out of her sight. Karen, on the other hand, let out an indignant huff. "This is completely unnecessary. I've been an outstanding member of this community for over 20 years. The HOA has full authority over property aesthetics, and that includes ensuring compliance with neighborhood standards." Lisa narrowed her eyes. "You're actually trying to justify this?" Karen tilted her chin up. "I am justifying it. If you had simply followed the rules like everyone else, I wouldn't have had to take such extreme measures. But no, you insist on being difficult. Your decorations are gaudy, your color scheme is inconsistent, and that," she gestured wildly at the still partially attached shelf, "is an eyesore." Lisa took a slow, deep breath through her nose. "Karen, you broke into my house." Karen rolled her eyes. "Yes, you keep repeating that." Lisa's grip on her phone tightened. "Because it's a crime." Before Karen could offer another self-righteous excuse, a set of blue and red lights flashed through the front windows, followed by the sound of tires rolling to a stop in her driveway. Karen's confidence flickered, just for a second, before she straightened her spine. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, brushing invisible dust off her pristine cardigan, as if preparing to handle an inconvenience rather than a full-blown arrest. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Lisa didn't even hesitate. She stormed to the front door, throwing it open to find two uniformed officers standing on her porch, one of them already scanning the scene inside. "Lisa Carter?" The taller officer, a gruff-looking man in his 40s, gave her a nod. "We received a report of a break-in." Lisa stepped aside, gesturing towards the disaster behind her. "Yeah, she's right there." The officer's gaze followed her hand. His expression barely shifted, but there was a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, like he was trying not to sigh. Karen, meanwhile, had the audacity to put on a smile. "Officers," she greeted, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension reserved for people who thought they were above the law. "There's been a misunderstanding." The second officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, pulled out a notepad. "You are Karen Whitmore?" Karen nodded, clasping her hands together primly. "Yes, and I'm a long-standing member of the HOA. This is all a simple miscommunication." "Ma'am," the first officer interrupted, stepping forward. "Are you a resident of this home?" Karen blinked. "Well, no, but do you have permission to be inside?" A flicker of hesitation. Well, I should," she huffed. "As a member of the HOA board, I have a duty to enforce." "That's a no, then," the younger officer said flatly. Lisa folded her arms, satisfaction settling deep in her chest. Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I was merely addressing a violation of community standards." "The HOA. I don't care about the HOA." The officer cut in, unimpressed. "What I care about is whether or not you unlawfully entered this home and caused damage to personal property." Lisa almost smiled. Finally, someone who wasn't willing to put up with Karen's nonsense. Karen, however, was still delusional enough to believe she had the upper hand. "You don't understand," she insisted, stepping closer to the officers like she could somehow explain her way out of this. "I was doing the neighborhood a favor. This woman has been violating policy for months, despite repeated warnings. And what policy gave you the right to enter her home without permission?" Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. The first officer sighed, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "That's what I thought." Lisa barely had time to process the sheer joy blooming in her chest before Karen gasped, stepping back as if she'd been personally insulted. "You can't be serious. You're under arrest for trespassing and vandalism," the officer said, his voice calm, practiced. "Turn around." Karen sputtered. "I'm the HOA. This is outrageous. Do you know who I am?" Lisa didn't bother holding back her grin this time. "Oh, we all know who you are, Karen." For the first time in her life, Karen looked genuinely rattled. The officers didn't flinch at her protests, nor did they offer her the courtesy of a conversation. Instead, the taller officer gestured sharply with his hand. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Karen's jaw worked, her indignation warring with the reality of the situation. "Now, let's be reasonable," she tried, her voice slipping into the condescending tone she had likely used to scold countless homeowners. "This isn't necessary. I was merely acting in accordance with HOA regulations." The younger officer didn't bother hiding her irritation. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override state law. You broke into someone's house." "I entered because I had a duty," Karen snapped. "That's not trespassing. If anything, she turned sharply to Lisa, eyes flashing. "She should be held accountable for her repeated violations. I sent multiple notices. She ignored them." Lisa scoffed. "So what? That gave you the right to break into my house and start tearing it apart." Karen lifted her chin. "Your noncompliance forced my hand." The officers exchanged a look. Then, without another word, the taller officer grabbed Karen's wrist and spun her around. The sharp click of the handcuffs was like music to Lisa's ears. Karen gasped, her entire body going rigid as cold metal snapped around her wrists. "You can't." Her voice rose in pitch, turning shrill, her composure cracking entirely. This is ridiculous. I'm a respected member of this community." "You're a trespasser," the officer corrected. Lisa bit back a laugh as Karen struggled, sputtering, her face turning redder by the second. "I'll have your badges for this. You're making a huge mistake." The officer didn't so much as blink. "You have the right to remain silent." "I will not remain silent," Karen shrieked, thrashing against the hold on her wrists. "This is an outrage. I was helping." Lisa crossed her arms, watching with undeniable satisfaction. "Karen, you broke into my house," she repeated slowly, savoring every syllable. Karen whipped her head around, her eyes burning with rage. "You don't deserve to live in this neighborhood." Lisa raised a brow. "And yet I do." The taller officer let out a breath through his nose, clearly at the end of his patience. "That's enough. Let's go." Karen's heels scraped against the floor as they guided her toward the door, still ranting at full volume. "This isn't over. I will be pressing charges. You'll regret this." "You." The younger officer, without missing a beat, pushed the door open and guided her straight outside. Lisa followed, leaning against the frame as the officers walked Karen toward the patrol car. Several neighbors had gathered on their porches, drawn by the flashing lights and Karen's unmistakable screeching. Jessica, Lisa's longtime friend and next-door neighbor, stood at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, lips twitching with barely concealed amusement. "Oh, wow," she murmured as Lisa approached. "She really went for it this time." Lisa let out a breathy laugh. "Broke into my house over a shelf." Jessica's brows lifted. "You're kidding." "Wish I was." Karen, still mid-rant, whipped her head toward the small crowd. "This is unacceptable. This is a violation of my rights. I was protecting the integrity of our neighborhood." One of the HOA board members, Ben Howard, the president, stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest. "Karen," he said, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. Karen turned, eyes alight with desperation. "Ben, finally, someone who understands. You need to tell them." But Ben just shook his head. "No, Karen." His voice was firm, exhausted. "We're done." Karen faltered. "What?" Ben let out a sigh, rubbing his temple. "This isn't the first time you've overstepped. We've ignored it, excused it, tried to rein you in. But breaking into someone's house..." He shook his head again. "We can't keep pretending this is okay." Karen's mouth opened, closed. For the first time, she had no argument. Ben turned to Lisa. We'll be holding an emergency HOA meeting first thing tomorrow. I'll be recommending immediate removal from the board." Lisa blinked. She hadn't expected it to happen this fast. "Seriously?" Ben nodded. "It's overdue." Lisa barely resisted the urge to pump a fist in victory. Karen, however, had finally snapped. "You can't," she shrieked, lunging forward before the officer's grip tightened on her arms, holding her back. "I am the HOA." Ben stared at her, unimpressed. "Not anymore." Lisa exchanged a glance with Jessica, who was grinning from ear to ear. The officers guided Karen the rest of the way into the patrol car, her protests muffled as the door shut behind her. Lisa exhaled, long and slow, as the patrol car pulled away, taking Karen and her reign of terror with it. Finally, peace. Lisa had never seen the neighborhood so alive. The moment the patrol car turned the corner and disappeared down the street, the gathered crowd broke into murmurs, hushed laughter, and a few hushed exclamations of disbelief. Even those who had long tolerated Karen's behavior stood in quiet shock, as if they couldn't quite believe the self-proclaimed ruler of the HOA had finally met her downfall. Jessica let out a low whistle, shaking her head. "I mean, I knew she was bad, but breaking into your house." She turned to Lisa, eyes wide with amusement and disbelief. "That woman actually thought she could get away with that." Lisa snorted. She did more than think it. She actually believed it was her right. Ben Howard, still standing with his arms crossed, looked every bit like a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "You have no idea how many complaints we've had about her," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "Most people were just too scared to say anything outright." Lisa turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Scared?" Ben sighed. "Karen doesn't just enforce the rules, she weaponizes them. She'd fine people over nonsense, report families for the smallest infractions, and whenever someone tried to challenge her, suddenly their cars were being towed for unauthorized parking, or their properties were being cited for violations that didn't even exist." Lisa exhaled slowly, a fresh wave of rage settling in her chest. How had this woman been allowed to hold power for so long? Jessica folded her arms. "So why didn't you all stop her before she started breaking into people's houses?" Ben let out a humorless chuckle. "Because Karen knew how to play the system. The board votes, sure, but she always managed to convince enough people that she was just following policy." His jaw tightened. "And those who opposed her? Well, let's just say it was easier to stay on her good side than deal with the hell she'd put you through." Lisa shook her head, barely able to comprehend it. An entire neighborhood held hostage by an old woman on a power trip? It would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. But at least it was over now. Jessica nudged her with an elbow. "So what's next? Are you pressing charges?" Lisa didn't even hesitate. "Oh, absolutely." Jessica grinned. "Good." Ben cleared his throat, looking genuinely remorseful. "Lisa, on behalf of the HOA, I want to formally apologize. We should have stopped her before it ever got to this point." Lisa studied him, gauging his sincerity. Eventually, she gave him a nod. "Just make sure it never happens again." He nodded back, his expression grim. "Trust me, she won't be coming back from this." And he was right. The emergency HOA meeting the next day was the most well-attended in the community's history. Every chair was filled, people stood against the walls, and even those who had never cared about HOA politics before were eager to see Karen officially removed. The decision wasn't just unanimous. It was enthusiastic. Karen, of course, wasn't there to protest. She was too busy dealing with her real problems: criminal charges for trespassing and vandalism, and the very real possibility of being sued for damages. By the time the meeting ended, Lisa could practically feel the relief in the air. Karen was gone. The tyranny was over. And for the first time since moving in, Lisa's home truly felt like hers. A week later, Lisa stood on her front porch, coffee in hand, as the late afternoon sun bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow. The tension that had once gripped the community had evaporated, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar feeling: peace. Karen was gone, officially, permanently, and without a shred of doubt. The HOA board had removed her from power so swiftly that even the most passive members hadn't questioned it. Reports of her behavior had spread like wildfire, and with Lisa's police report backing everything up, Karen had lost every last scrap of credibility she once wielded. No more surprise inspections. No more ridiculous citations. No more smug, self-righteous lectures about community standards. And best of all, no more HOA tyranny. Lisa took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction sink in. The sound of footsteps on pavement made her glance to the side. Jessica approached with a grin, holding 2 cupcakes in her hands. Celebratory dessert? Lisa smirked and took one. You know me well. Jessica plopped down on the porch swing, stretching out her legs. So, how does it feel to be the woman who took down the neighborhood menace? Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. Honestly, it still doesn't feel real. She took a bite of the cupcake, savoring the sweetness. I mean, I knew Karen was bad, but I never thought she'd be bold enough to break into my house. Jessica let out a sharp laugh. She was bold, all right. Bold and stupid. Lisa chuckled, and now she gets to explain her stupidity to a judge. Jessica clinked her cupcake against Lisa's in a mock toast. To justice. To justice, Lisa agreed. The neighborhood had changed overnight. With Karen gone, people started reclaiming their homes in little ways. Porch swings were repainted, seasonal decorations appeared in windows, and the stifling sense of fear that had lingered for years finally lifted. Lisa leaned back in her chair, watching as a few kids rode their bikes down the street, laughter filling the air. It felt right. She glanced at her front yard, where her garden gnome collection sat in perfect defiance of everything Karen had stood for. For the first time since moving in, Lisa felt truly at home. And this time, no one, not even an entitled HOA tyrant, could take that away from her.